My name is Leanne Alexander. I'm coming to you today from Pentecostal Publishing House with another teacher training video. Now, we've talked in previous videos about the importance of teaching to reach the heart. And today, I want to give you one of the techniques that can help us do that. Today, we're talking about connecting to our students with storytelling. Now, this may look different age group to age group, and we'll talk about that, but let me just start by just really emphasizing the value of stories. Too many times, it's easy to just go into a list of general things that we want students to do. Be apostolic, do this, believe this, think this. And we don't really give a context and a way to illustrate how to go about doing that. Stories can help us move from these general statements and see a way that we actually apply that. It's interesting because the University of Toronto did a study and spent no telling how many dollars to say what we intuitively know, and that's that stories are very powerful. They specifically were impressed by how the brain actually multitasks when we hear a story. If I were going to tell you a story about a little boy in a blue shirt ran out of the house with the red door and started running toward the street chasing a purple volleyball. And his mom steps to the doorway and calls after him as a big black truck begins coming down the road. Now, two things are happening. First of all, your brain's catching all of those details. The boy had a blue shirt. The ball was a purple ball. The house had a red door. A black truck's coming. So you're catching all those details on the micro level, but at the same time, on the macro level, your brain's already looking for the action of what's going to happen in the story. And you're starting to perhaps look for a moral of the story. And again, scientists are fascinated that our brains can do that. Even the youngest of our children can understand a story and how the details lead to this overarching moral of the story. And of course, the simple answer in my mind is that God created us that way. And it isn't any wonder that Jesus taught in parables, and even the Bible, so much of it is in narrative or story format. And I think that tells us as teachers, we've got to use these stories in our teaching. And so that's why with our curriculum from Pentecostal Publishing House, you'll see that all of our age levels and all of our lines of curriculum, whether Word of Flame or the Discipleship Project, for the Bible lesson, the heart of the teaching material, we are going to take a story from Scripture and we're going to use that to illustrate whatever our big idea or lesson point is for that session. And it's because our brains, and not just our brains, but our hearts connect to those stories. So I believe what this means is that in whatever format you have to teach, you make sure that you have a story as the heart of that teaching concept. It can illustrate this main idea that we want to do. It's not just a list of do this and do that, but when we see from Scripture how that principle is illustrated, it can really resonate on a heart level and not just because somebody's told me some behavior that I should memorize and emulate. So a couple of points then. Number one, we want to tell that story as compellingly as we can. So for our children's levels, this means all the fun of bringing the bathrobe and having a volunteer act out the story. It may mean getting the whole class involved. So when we're on the stormy sea, the whole class rocks and we have everybody in the boat and we're together in that story in that moment. For our adults and for our youth, I believe that this means we introduce humor and we sometimes tell a story about ourselves. Sure, we're going to tell a story from Scripture, but I want to encourage you, find ways to share a personal story that illustrates that point. It's one thing for me to say everybody should pray, but if I can tell a story about a time prayer worked in my life, now I've just made a personal connection. I've made this easier for my students to see how that applies on a personal level. And again, sometimes I'm involving humor in that story to capture attention, but I'm making those stories connect to the hearts of the audience, whether child, whether adult, whether youth. And then the third thing I want to say to wrap up is that, especially for our children's levels, it's important that we tell that story accurately in biblically sound way. And that sounds very obvious, but I do want to caution us again, especially on the children's levels. We have to be careful not to mix stories. A lot of times there's a temptation. We want to add some fun to the Bible. And of course, I believe that the stories from the Bible are compelling as they are. But sometimes I've seen us try to say, okay, we're going to tell the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. But in this way that we tell it, we're on planet Mars and everybody's dressed in spacesuits and we're doing, and understand again, that impulse is just to add creativity. But if we're not careful, we have so many students who already struggle with biblical illiteracy and they don't know the Bible. And then when we add these extra layers, okay, now what really happened in Bible time and what So I want to caution us as teachers to stay within the Bible, and let's teach Scripture as it is. And we can add voice inflections, we can add sound effects, and we can add costumes, and we can get children involved in acting out the story, and the class involved in that story. And we can use those methods for creativity and make sure that we're really capturing what happened in the Bible and we're telling that story soundly. So, to summarize, number one, tell those stories as compellingly as we can. Number two, whatever the age level is, use those stories to illustrate how we can make personal application for our lives today. Number three, let's be sure that we tell that story accurately from Scripture. And I believe by using stories, we can connect to the hearts. We're moving beyond just, here's the information, think about it and go do it, but we're really showing, and we're doing it in a way that connects in a very personal way to the heart. So stay tuned for more training videos about the value of teaching to reach